What makes people vulnerable to lies? Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler, and I've been asking that question because of the circumstance that we find ourselves in the United States in this era. I ran for Congress as a Democratic nominee in Virginia's very Republican 6th district back in 2012 because already uh, the truth was defeating the lie so much that I felt that truth telling required people to step forward and be its champions. My motto was truth for a change. And of course, the situation's only become more dangerous in terms of the lie defeating the truth in the years since then. And so I've been asking that question: what makes people vulnerable to lies? There are many dimensions of the answer, and so one of them is kind of interesting because it takes our greatest human capacity, our intelligence, and that in itself creates a kind of vulnerability that we don't share with other creatures. Other creatures, for the most part, they can be fooled sometimes with a trap that sort of is telling them, and not in words, of course, this is a safe place to walk into when it's not. But for the most part, they either, if you can talk about beliefs that deer and rabbits and bears and things like that have, they're either evolved into them because those beliefs were in accord with reality sufficiently that they have those orientations toward their perceptions because they have been evolutionarily adaptive, or they grew out of their own direct experience. We have both of those kinds of components, but because we're cultural animals, we get a lot of our beliefs from what we're told by the culture around us. And that creates an opportunity for culture to tell us things that are not in good correspondence with reality, not having been affirmed by the evolutionary process as being adaptive. And adaptive means some kind of correspondence with reality, not having grown out of our own experience. In addition to that, in terms of being hoisted by our own petard and victimized in some respects by our greatest strengths, there's also our capacity for imagination. I mean, I watch movies, I enter into the stories, and I identify with the action, and I can get very stressed by what I see, even though I know that what I'm watching is a fiction. It seems as though we can know something and not know something at the same time. That kind of complex psychology where we can be captivated by our imagination, I think also contributes to a vulnerability. When I've been watching what's been happening on the political right in America, where, and you can see this laid out by me in a video called The Politics of Falsehoods, on a whole lot of issues, guns, climate change, race relations. I mean, just could, the picture has been painted of something which is clearly not true, yet it's believed. And I've wondered, particularly when it came to certain kinds of lies that have been dealt with so extensively, like the big lie, as they call it, that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. And apparently, something like 2/3 plus of the Republican base believes that or at least they tell pollsters they believe it was stolen from Donald Trump, even though there's no evidence for that. And there are mountains of evidence that prove that that's not true. So I've wondered, which is the case? Do they actually know the truth, but embrace the lie anyway for whatever reason? Or do they somehow buy the lie in spite of its being against all kinds of evidence? This business about, like, what is our psyche that we can have more than one thing in it, that I can watch a movie and know that it's just a movie, but experience it as if this is really happening, and I am identifying with some character that I care about, who's in danger, or something bad is happening and I feel the pain. But it isn't just all humanity that is equally vulnerable to the lie, and so there are other factors that come in. One of the things that I have looked at is family structure. There's a fair amount of literature about things like a family in which children are growing up, and let's say one of the parents is an alcoholic, maybe an alcoholic father who is violent and irrational, somewhat crazy and destructive. Yet the family culture might require of the people, the children growing up in that family, that they not see what's right in front of their eyes, or see it and act like they don't see it, or some combination of the two, which is what we were talking about before. There's the family secret, which is sort of open and right out front, but everybody has to pretend that it's true. And maybe the pretense gets to the point where the person, at least consciously, blots out the truth. The reality is not permitted in the family culture. I believe that you can find things in the studies that were done of the way German children were brought up that made the German people vulnerable to the kinds of big lies that regime was selling. And there are dimensions of this of this growing up in a family culture, which requires people to believe things that are obviously false, and to deny what's right in front of their eyes, which is what's going on in America today that I find so disturbing. My family culture inculcated in me a rather profound commitment to the idea of the truth. So I find it very disturbing when I encounter what we see in America today, where tens of millions of people are believing a lot of lies. In addition to that, there are, besides the family, there are widespread cultural patterns that can be implicated in making people vulnerable to the lie. The family structure thing is not particularly regional, but it does, that kind of a more authoritarian family does correlate to some extent in the history of American culture with the same region as gave us the slave power and gave us the Jim Crow regime, and nowadays is requiring a lot of schools not to teach some of the important truth about American history and the place of race relations, for example. There is, in the cultural aftermath of the Civil War, it's been very well documented. There has been the institutionalization of some basic lies about what the Civil War was about, and you call it the War of Northern Aggression, and say it wasn't about slavery. It even got mandated in the cultural system through the educational system that falsehoods about the Civil War be taught, and people who teachers who might teach what now would be recognized by reputable historians as the truth about that time would be fired. there was an enforcement of orthodoxy. And that connects also with cultures of conformity, so that some people who talk about the what's developed in conservative America have spoken about the greater importance of, in a sense, towing the collective line. That you're taught to be to adopt the beliefs of your friends, your family, your general community. The toleration of dissidence, of nonconformity, is lesser there than in liberal America, which is why people, talk about, trying to organize Democrats or Unitarians or whatever as being like herding cats. Each side has its vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities of the people who are hard to herd, like herding cats, are different from the vulnerabilities of the people who will get in line and toe the line. And I live in the Virginia Shenandoah Valley, and I can see that conservative tendency in the direction of conformity of belief. It can be a strength for a community, but it becomes a weakness or a problem for the society as a whole if the conformity is to beliefs that are basically false. And I do have experience about people do not want to be seen by their community to have rejected the lies. The people who do reject those lies like to keep it to themselves, because stepping out of line is not allowed. But there's also a dimension here that has to do with authority. It's not as though the people in the current Republican base that believe a lot of lies, and again, I can refer you to the politics of falsehood. It's not as though they believe everything they're told. They believe what they're told by authorities that are that have established themselves as these are the ones to believe. I remember when I did talk radio out here before a lot of this victory of the lie over the truth had established itself on the political right. But there was already a cultural foundation that was facilitated this, in terms of if you could get the right authorities telling you certain things. I mean, and that already was happening on issues like guns and climate change and things like that. But there was a bumper sticker that one would see around here, and that I ultimately, after a couple of years, I was kind of afraid to engage with it. I did talk radio with callers, most of whom were conservative, and many of whom I really respected and felt fond of. There was a bumper sticker that went, "God said it, I believe it, and that settles it." And my way of doing radio was to try to create a culture of discourse, of inquiry, the pursuit of the truth, an open-minded, honest pursuit of the truth, and the idea that settles it was something that I felt in that pursuit at least wanted to confront, which I did, and it actually was a good show. But you get into a culture in which inquiry is not a virtue, and acceptance of authority, like the Bible for beginning, like the Scopes trial, the continuing struggle against the idea of evolution, because God said it. If you have this way of regarding the Bible as the inerrant word of God, that shows a way of relating to authority. The Bible is an authority, but then you can get individuals who function as authorities. And we see that on the political right now, there is that authority of a figure who I think will go down in history as the most prodigious and impactful liar in human history. But he has a standing with the Republican base, which I have sought very hard to understand, and without great success. But there is a standing that he has such that if he tells them that there's a lot of widespread election fraud in 2020, or that he's being politically persecuted, or that all these indictments are just politically motivated, in spite of huge, there is that kind of an authority which seems to be a capacity for human beings, maybe just in civilization, I don't know, but we've seen it before that people can form a well, these days people are calling it a cult. I don't know if there's a better word, but I've looked a lot at this in terms of some kind of a trance state. The hypnotist is the quintessential credible authority when a person goes into the trance state, as I understand hypnosis. You can get that something could be right in front of people, but if the hypnotist says it's not there, people don't see it. And people can be told something that is true that's false, and yet they believe it. I believe that, for example, that if you put a coin on somebody's skin and you tell them it's red hot, in a trance state, a person can actually develop a blister. So people can develop a relationship with authority, and not just in this case, Donald Trump. When I ran for Congress and tried to speak to the 65 to 70% of the district that was Republican, I found that the Republican Party, if the Republican Party said it, they believe it, and that settles it. No additional information was really admissible. It was really quite remarkable to me. I had observed this during the W administration, that they were being taught, don't believe anything that the Democrats say, don't believe anything that a liberal says, don't believe what the journalists say, don't believe what the scientists say, and don't believe what people in other countries are saying about, say, the invasion of Iraq or whatever the deal was. There is, you will listen only to my voice was a part of that pattern. So some of it's human nature or a human capacity. Some of it may be a human capacity that's generated by a certain kind of cultural upbringing. And some of it, I think, also takes advantage of kinds of education that emphasize what is required of you is to repeat what you've been told. Critical thinking is not being taught. I don't know how much critical thinking has ever been taught in American schools. I would have a hypothesis that if you were to track the way the schools have functioned, at least in certain areas of the country, say from, let's say from the time that from the 70s and 80s, say, and then ever since, that you would find that critical thinking is less uh, instilled in people than it used to be. And I've asked myself, to what extent are we rational creatures by nature? We have that capacity, obviously. I was trained in it very strongly by in my family culture, particularly by my dad, who was a really excellent thinker. Very rational, called himself the child of the Enlightenment. He was a professor of economics. I'm told that if he had lived long enough and he died just a bit before his 49th birthday, which is a great tragedy in my life, that he might have won the Nobel Prize in economics. I was strongly trained in analytic, critical thinking. How much of that is human nature? I mean, you look at the anthropological literature about all kinds of other cultures and their mythologies. Is somebody who thinks rationally and critically, who applies reason to evidence, some kind of breaking out of the human norm? It could be. Science itself as a discipline. Galileo and people like that who gathered data and drew inferential conclusions. That emerged. I mean, we might think it was Galileo was a long time ago. When was he? 16 something or other in Italy. But that's only 400 years ago, whereas the history of our species goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and before that, we've got a growing intelligence, and civilization began 10 or 12,000 years ago. So I don't know. But if we're going to make the people who set up American democracy, they were the children of the Enlightenment, people like Jefferson, and that was the period of the Enlightenment. In England, people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, and this was a time when, also called the Age of Reason, when that was happening, and they set up a governmental system that was predicated on a couple of things that had to be characteristic of the citizenry. One that gets called Republican virtue, Republican and not in the political party sense, but and they thought that there had to be a degree of virtue in the citizens to make the system work. But the other one was that they hoped that the freedom of speech and the freedom of press would expose people to the necessary information to draw the right conclusions, or at least enough people drawing the right conclusions that they would express their intentions at the ballot box in a way that would allow the country as a whole to choose a rational way forward. I grew up in America in let's say the 1950s, when I was, becoming aware of the country, where I think the country was finding its way forward in a rational way, and had for maybe 20 years before that under FDR and Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, and there was a lot of rationality that governed how the country was making decisions. It wasn't perfect. The best and the brightest got us into a catastrophe in Vietnam, but overall we were making pretty decent decisions, and the constitutional system was working pretty well. We've got so many people who seem to be so vulnerable to the lie that it's not clear that we can do what obviously we need to do, like get aid to Ukraine instead of letting this, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory over our major adversary in the world, and like keeping the government open. And it's not clear whether even American democracy is going to survive. So I ask myself questions like, what makes people vulnerable to the lie? And also, when people become vulnerable to the lie and they buy into lies, what can we as a culture do to bring them back into better contact with reality? I'm not going to address that here. That's an issue in itself. I will address it. Thanks for listening.